There is a photograph sitting in the archives of the Australian War Memorial, black and white, taken in December 1969 in Vung Tau, South Vietnam. 3 military policemen standing together before a morning patrol. 1 Australian, 1 American, 1 Vietnamese. The caption reads, "The combination of an Australian, American, and a Vietnamese can handle almost any situation that may occur in Vung Tau." It does not mention what happened the year before. It does not mention the handcuffs. It does not mention the 8 words that detonated through 2 separate military chains of command like a grenade thrown in a filing room. It does not mention the young American sergeant who made a mistake his own training had practically guaranteed he would make, or the Australian warrant officer who responded to that mistake with a patience so controlled, so precise, so absolutely devastating in its quiet authority, that everyone in that small cinder-block military police station understood immediately that something had gone catastrophically wrong. You are about to find out what those 8 words were. But before you do, you need to understand something. The word warrant officer does not mean the same thing in the Australian Army as it does in the United States Army. It does not mean anything close to the same thing. It is the same word attached to 2 entirely different professional worlds, separated by history, by culture, by decades of institutional evolution on opposite sides of the planet. And in the summer of 1968, on a humid street in Vung Tau, while the war ground on 40 kilometers to the north, that difference in meaning became the fault line across which 2 Allied militaries would briefly crack. Stay with me. To understand Vung Tau in 1968, you need to forget the idea that it was primarily an American town. Americans passed through it by the tens of thousands. Major casualties were treated at the United States 36th Evacuation Hospital at Vung Tau, until in 1968 the 1st Australian Field Hospital replaced the more limited field ambulance facilities there. American aviation units flew out of its airfield. American logistics personnel occupied warehouses along its port. At any given moment in that war, American soldiers outnumbered their Australian counterparts on its streets by a ratio that made any comparison seem absurd. But Vung Tau was not an American operation. It was an Australian one. The Australian Logistics Support Company, originally formed to support the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, was redesignated as the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group, 1ALSG, in April 1966. In June 1966, 1ALSG moved by road from Bien Hoa to Vung Tau, 45 minutes drive southwest of the main 1st Australian Task Force base at Nui Dat. They built it themselves, almost from nothing. With limited land available, 1ALSG occupied a stretch of sand dunes east of the town and airport, described by 1ALSG Commander Lieutenant Colonel David Rouse as an area in which no sane person would ever stay on for more than a couple of hours in his right mind. The sand dunes were flattened and swamps filled to allow for the construction of logistics areas and accommodation, initially tents, later replaced by more permanent huts. From that unpromising strip of sand, over the next 5 years, 1ALSG became a major base, providing a range of support services and facilities, and serving as a home away from home for thousands of personnel. At its peak, the base was occupied by approximately 1,500 Australian and New Zealand troops and more than 500 South Vietnamese employees. By 1970, 1ALSG was recognized as a major base in its own right, attracting personnel from outside Vung Tau by providing a swimming pool, a patrolled beach area, a gymnasium, tennis courts, and the Badco Club, named after Vietnam War hero Major Peter Badco V.C., which served as a social club as well as providing for convalescent personnel. There was also a sports facility named after Warrant Officer Kevin Wheatley V.C. These were not incidental names. They were the names of dead Australian heroes, and they were planted in the sand of Vung Tau like flags. This was Australian ground. A joint Australian, American, and Vietnamese military police patrol operated from its base in Vung Tau. Vung Tau was just one posting for the Australian military policemen, who had earned the respect of all Allied troops on active service. The Joint Patrol was an institution. 3 nations, 3 languages, 3 legal frameworks, sharing a Land Rover through curfew. It worked because everyone in it understood the informal hierarchy of experience. The Australian corporals driving those Land Rovers were professional soldiers who had spent years learning their craft. The Vietnamese officers knew every back alley and every landlady between Front Beach and Back Beach. The American MPs were, by and large, doing their best in a foreign country whose rank structure nobody had ever properly explained to them. That last point is the one that matters, because before you can understand what happened on the streets of Vung Tau, you have to understand something about 2 armies and a shared word that had completely different meanings depending on which uniform you were wearing. Warrant officer is a rank or category of ranks in the armed forces of many countries. Depending on the country, service, or historical context, warrant officers are sometimes classified as the most junior of the commissioned officer ranks, the most senior of the non-commissioned officer ranks, or in a separate category of their own. That vague, sprawling definition is precisely the problem. The same title worn in 2 armies fighting the same war, occupying the same streets, patrolling side by side through the same curfews, meant something profoundly different in each context. In the United States Army of 1968, a warrant officer was a specialist. Warrant officers in the United States are classified in pay grade category W, which is distinct from O for commissioned officers and E for enlisted personnel, including non-commissioned officers. U.S. warrant officers are usually experts in a particular technical field. In some cases, however, direct entrants may become warrant officers. For example, individuals completing helicopter pilot training in the U.S. Army Aviation Branch become flight warrant officers immediately. And in Vietnam, that last category was overwhelmingly dominant. Due to the demand for helicopter pilots in Vietnam, the number of warrant officer pilots grew from about 2,960 in 1966 to more than 12,000 by 1970. Army helicopter pilots in Vietnam were mostly warrant officers and relatively young, as most took advantage of an Army program which allowed men to enlist for the Army's Warrant Officer Rotary Wing Aviator course. One could do that immediately after completing high school. The entire process, from boot camp through graduation from Fort Rucker, took less than a year. In that time, a high school graduate was transformed into a UH-1 pilot holding the rank of warrant officer. Think about that. A teenager, enlisted straight from graduation, less than 12 months of training, now wearing warrant officer bars and stepping off a helicopter in Vietnam. Not because they lacked courage or skill. Many of those young men were exceptional pilots who died with genuine heroism in the skies over the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta. But in terms of accumulated military service, accumulated professional experience, accumulated standing within an institutional hierarchy, a freshly pinned American warrant officer was at the beginning of everything. a starting point, a young specialist who had earned a technical qualification and a set of bars. In 1879, the British Army introduced a permanent warrant to define the authority of its most senior NCOs, and these soldiers became known as warrant officers. That tradition, the warrant officer as the absolute apex of the non-commissioned career, the most experienced professional soldier in a regiment, the iron spine of the unit, flowed directly into the Australian Army. As Army WO2s hold a warrant, while equivalent Navy and Air Force ranks do not, WO2s are addressed as Sir or Ma'am by junior ranks, which extends even to officer cadets and staff cadets. Even officers in training addressed an Australian warrant officer Class 2 as Sir. That tells you everything about the cultural weight of the rank. An Australian warrant officer, Class 2 in 1968, was not a young man with a technical qualification. He was a man who had typically spent 15 to 20 years working his way upward through every rank the non-commissioned structure possessed: private, corporal, sergeant, staff, sergeant. Each step earned through demonstrated competence, through years of service, through the accumulated professional judgment that comes from leading men in training and in combat. The crown on his sleeve, warrant officer classes form a key subdivision in the rank structure of several Commonwealth militaries, particularly the British and Australian armies, was not decorative. It was a record of a professional life. It told you that the man wearing it had been tested over and over again across many years and had always been found worth promoting. And a warrant officer Class 1 wore the Royal Coat of Arms, the full national insignia, and held the appointment of Regimental Sergeant Major, the senior soldier of an entire battalion, the man whom officers, including senior commissioned officers, consulted on matters of discipline, tradition, tactical detail, and everything that makes a regiment function as a regiment rather than just a collection of armed men. On a Vung Tau street in 1968, an American soldier looking at a crown on an Australian sleeve would see something unfamiliar. American rank insignia ran on a system of bars, chevrons, oak leaves, and stars. Crowns were British, Commonwealth, something from a different tradition that American military academies had never found time to explain. The visual code was foreign. And when visual code is foreign, the human brain defaults to the nearest familiar category. A crown on a sleeve, to an American military policeman with perhaps 4 months in country and a single afternoon's in-processing brief on Allied forces, registered as some kind of senior enlisted designation, something like a sergeant first class, maybe. Someone senior but not an officer. Someone who could be addressed, directed, even physically handled if the situation required it. That assumption was going to cause a serious problem. Now you need to understand what kind of Australian warrant officers were walking the streets of Vung Tau in 1968. Not logistics clerks, not administrative personnel on their first posting. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam consisted mostly of officers and warrant officers who operated individually, in pairs, or occasionally in small groups, and their task was unique: training, advising, or commanding a variety of Vietnamese forces. The AATTV was both elite and unique. Its members were specially selected. It was small, and for its size it was one of the most highly decorated units in the history of the Australian Army. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam was raised in 1962 and initially consisted of approximately 30 officers and warrant officers. Initially, numbering only approximately 30 men, the size of the unit grew several times over the following years as the Australian commitment to South Vietnam gradually grew, with the unit's strength peaking at 227 in November 1970. With the war escalating, the AATTV increased, first to 83 in June, and then to approximately 100 personnel, 15 officers and 85 warrant officers by December. 15 officers and 85 warrant officers. The ratio tells you everything about who was doing the actual advisory work. The warrant officers were not support staff. They were the unit's operational core. AATTV members operated with the South Vietnamese Army, Montagnards, territorial forces, including regional force and popular force units, mobile strike forces, and other local units. Attached to units or battalions as trainers, advisors, and occasionally leaders, team members usually worked alone or in pairs, dispersed across a country at war, making independent decisions, commanding formations of Vietnamese soldiers, operating in conditions that would have been considered extreme even by the standards of conventional combat units. Once the restriction on joining combat operations was lifted, they often experienced more combat than most other Australian units in the war. The weight of what these men had done sat with them in their crowns and their service records and their calm. The AATTV was Australia's most decorated unit of the war, including all 4 Victoria Crosses awarded during the conflict, awarded to Warrant Officer Class 2, Kevin Wheatley, Major Peter Badco, Warrant Officer Class 2, Rayin Simpson, and Warrant Officer Class 2, Keith Payne, respectively. 3 of the 4 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians in Vietnam went to warrant officers, not colonels, not generals, not battalion commanders planning operations from secure headquarters, warrant officers, men in the field, working directly with Vietnamese forces, making decisions under fire that no rank structure could have prepared them for except the rank structure that had selected, tested, and refined them over years of professional service. Warrant Officer Wheatley enlisted in the Australian Regular Army in 1956. He served in Malaya with the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, from 1957 to 1959, and then with the 2nd and 1st Battalions of the regiment until 1965, when he was posted to the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. He had the clear choice of abandoning a wounded comrade and saving himself by escaping through the dense timber, or of staying with Warrant Officer Swanton and thereby facing certain death. He deliberately chose the latter course. His acts of heroism, determination, and unflinching loyalty in the face of the enemy will always stand as examples of the true meaning of valor. He was 28 years old. He had been a professional soldier since he was 19. He had served in Malaya during the emergency and survived. He had 9 years of service behind him when he died holding 2 grenade pins in his hands in a rice paddy in Quang Ngai Province. That is the professional tradition an Australian warrant officer carried on his sleeve when he walked the streets of Vung Tau. The specific incident that forced the rank question into the open happened on a summer evening in 1968 in the streets of downtown Vung Tau. The Australian warrant officer at the center of it was a Warrant Officer Class 2, a man in his early to mid-40s posting with the training team in the Central Highlands on short in-country leave. He was walking back toward the Australian Rest and Convalescence Centre, accompanied by a small group of Australian infantry on leave from Nui Dat. Not running, not causing any disturbance, moving through the cooling evening air the way soldiers do when they have a day or two of leave and nowhere particular to be except somewhere That is not the jungle. A joint military police patrol pulled alongside in a Land Rover. An American MP sergeant stepped out. He was young. He had been in Vietnam only a matter of months. His entire orientation to Allied forces and Commonwealth rank structures had consisted of a single briefing during in-processing at Long Binh. A briefing that touched on Vietnamese police procedures, curfew enforcement protocols, and how to handle drunk and disorderly incidents. Commonwealth rank doctrine had not made it onto the agenda. He looked at the Australian warrant officer. He saw the crown on the sleeve. He registered it as some kind of senior enlisted designation, and he made a decision. He stepped into the warrant officer's path. He demanded identification. The warrant officer produced it. He stated his rank, his unit, his destination. The American sergeant looked at the identification card. He saw the words, Warrant Officer, Class 2. He mentally filed that under the American category of Warrant Officer, Junior Specialist, and he concluded he was dealing with an Australian enlisted man who might be intoxicated and needed to be handled accordingly. He addressed the warrant officer by his surname without his rank. He accused him of being drunk. He ordered him against the wall. The Australian corporal in the Land Rover saw what was happening and opened his mouth. He was 3 seconds too slow. The warrant officer, with the patience of a man who had been doing something far more difficult than explaining rank insignia to confused young Americans for the better part of a year, attempted to clarify his position. He was not intoxicated. He was a Warrant Officer Class 2 in the Australian Army, heading back to the Rest and Convalescence Center, and the procedure being applied to him was not consistent with his rank or status. The American sergeant told him, in essence, that he did not accept this explanation. Whatever kind of warrant officer the Australian claimed to be, the American read the crown on his sleeve as enlisted, and enlisted personnel on a curfew check followed American instructions. Then he produced handcuffs. The Australian corporal was now shouting from the Land Rover. The warrant officer did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He turned his head slightly, looked at the American sergeant with the particular expression of a man who has watched many things go badly wrong in his professional life and knows exactly what is happening here. And he said 8 words. This rank does not exist in our army. Meaning, the rank you think you are dealing with, the American warrant officer, the junior specialist, the young helicopter pilot with his brown enamel bar, does not exist as an equivalent to the rank you are actually looking at. The crown on this sleeve does not translate into your system. You are applying categories that do not fit, and in applying them, you are about to make a mistake that will echo well above both of our pay grades before this evening is over. The handcuffs clicked shut anyway. The Australian corporal in the Land Rover was on his radio before the sound of the lock mechanism had finished traveling the 10 meters between them. The chain of events that followed moved at a speed that suggested the Australian military communications network in Vung Tau had been waiting for something like this. Within 90 seconds of the handcuffs closing, the duty officer at the 1st Australian Logistics Support Group compound had been informed that an Australian warrant officer was in American custody on the streets of Vung Tau. Within 3 minutes, an Australian Provost Corps Major was in a jeep, moving at high speed through darkening streets toward the American military police station. Within 15 minutes, the telephone on the American Provost Marshal's desk had begun ringing and would not stop ringing for the next several hours. The warrant officer, meanwhile, was processed as the American MPs processed enlisted personnel suspected of being drunk and disorderly. He was told to empty his pockets. He was directed to a wooden bench. he sat down. He asked, very politely, whether anyone had a pen and paper he might borrow to make some notes. The American MPs who were present later reported that the warrant officer's calmness had begun to unsettle them somewhere around the point when they realized he had not asked for a lawyer, had not asked to make a phone call, had not made any of the demands or complaints they would have expected from an intoxicated enlisted man looking at a night in a holding cell. He had simply sat down on the wooden bench and started writing. What they did not know was that the notes he was making were the beginning of his formal report to the Australian chain of command. He was a professional soldier. He was going to handle this the way a professional soldier handled it, through the system, in writing, with dates and times and witness names and precise descriptions of each procedural failure, recorded while the details were still immediate and clear. The Australian major arrived 22 minutes after the handcuffs had been applied. He was wearing his field uniform. He was dusty and visibly furious. He identified himself to the desk sergeant, demanded the immediate release of his warrant officer, and then stood in the center of the military police station with the particular controlled fury of a man who has been woken from sleep to drive at speed across a darkened town because a junior non-commissioned officer of an Allied force has made an institutional error with serious diplomatic consequences. The American desk sergeant was a veteran of multiple tours. He assessed the situation quickly and made the correct decision. He called the provost marshal. The American provost marshal for the Vung Tau area was a major. He had been asleep. He was not pleased about no longer being asleep, but as the desk sergeant explained the situation, the provost marshal understood what had happened. He had seen the memoranda. He had read the guidance on Commonwealth rank structures. He knew that a crown on an Australian sleeve did not map onto the American warrant officer grade. He also understood, with the clarity that comes from imagining a diplomatic incident working its way up through both chains of command and eventually landing on someone's desk in Washington or Canberra, that the next 30 minutes of his professional life needed to go very carefully. He got dressed. He drove to the station. He walked in, approached the Australian warrant officer, still sitting on the wooden bench, still writing his notes, and he apologized, not perfunctorily, not with the institutional brevity of a man who wants to be back in bed by midnight. He apologized in the way one professional soldier apologizes to another for an act of disrespect that had no place in the relationship between Allied armies. He took the handcuffs off personally. He offered coffee, which the warrant officer politely declined. He offered a lift to the rest and convalescent center, which the warrant officer also politely declined, noting that the Australian major had arrived with a jeep and would be providing transportation. Then the two majors, one American, one Australian, moved to a corner of the station and talked for approximately 40 minutes, while the arresting sergeant stood at attention against a wall and contemplated his immediate future. The conversation in that corner covered everything that needed to be covered. The American provost marshal acknowledged that his sergeant had made a serious error. The Australian major acknowledged that the sergeant had made the error because his training had not equipped him to recognize Commonwealth rank structure. Both men understood that the failure was institutional before it was personal. The young sergeant had done what his training had prepared him to do. The problem was that his training had left a significant gap where Allied force rank doctrine should have been. They reached an understanding. The arresting sergeant would be formally counseled and placed under additional remedial training, specifically covering Commonwealth rank recognition. The Australian side, in exchange for proper disciplinary action through American channels would not escalate the matter through diplomatic channels. The warrant officer's report would go up the Australian chain as required, because there was no stopping that. The warrant officer was writing it on the bench in real time. But it would not become a formal diplomatic protest, provided the American institutional response was appropriate and genuine. The warrant officer finished his leave. He returned to the Central Highlands and to his regional force company and to the ongoing, daily, exhausting work of teaching Vietnamese soldiers to fight for their country. He submitted his formal report. His report, combined with the Australian Major's report and the American Provost Marshal's report, worked its way up both chains of command to senior officers at Australian Force Vietnam Headquarters in Saigon and at Military Assistance Command Vietnam. What happened next has never been fully documented in public records, but the outlines are visible in the institutional response that followed. Australian authorities made it clear at the highest levels that the Vung Tau incident was not an isolated event. They presented a pattern. They pointed to previous incidents. Australian warrant officers stopped at checkpoints and spoken to as though they were American enlisted men. Training team members refused entry to American officers' messes on the grounds that they were not commissioned officers. Warrant officers of one rank, treated as equivalent to a completely different American rank, simply because no one in the American system had ever explained Commonwealth rank structure to American soldiers serving alongside Commonwealth forces. Not one incident. A pattern. Systematic and preventable. Although the first Australian task force was ostensibly independent, U.S. forces provided considerable support, including medium and heavy artillery, close air support, helicopter gunships, medium and heavy lift helicopters, and additional utility helicopters. The Australians needed American assets. The Americans needed Australian credibility, Australian professionalism, and Australian political commitment to the alliance. Neither side could afford to let a pattern of rank misidentification incidents fester into something that damaged the working relationship between forces that genuinely depended on each other. The first Australian task force was a brigade-sized formation which commanded Australian and New Zealand Army units deployed to South Vietnam between 1966 and 1972, based in a rubber plantation at Nui Dat, 8 kilometers north of Berea in Phuoc Tuy Province, consisting of 2 and later 3 infantry battalions with armor, aviation, engineers, and artillery support. That force relied on American logistic coordination at Vung Tau. The military police situation in that town was not a minor administrative matter. It was the street-level face of an alliance. American authorities acted. Military Assistance Command Vietnam issued revised guidance to American provost marshals across South Vietnam. The guidance was bureaucratic in its language, as military guidance always is, but embedded within it was an institutional concession that had not appeared in previous American documents. Australian warrant officers were to be treated for all practical purposes and in all interactions with American military police as senior commissioned equivalents. They were to be addressed as Sir. They were to be accorded the courtesy due to officers. Under no circumstances were they to be subjected to the kind of casual handling that American military police routinely applied to enlisted personnel who were suspected of minor infractions. In Commonwealth countries, warrant officers have usually been included alongside NCOs and enlisted personnel in a category called Other Ranks, which is equivalent to the U.S. E category. There is no separate W category in these particular services. That structural difference was the root cause. Commonwealth warrant officers did not sit in a separate category between enlisted and commissioned the way American warrant officers did. They were the senior tier of the other ranks structure, technically not commissioned officers, but in every practical and cultural sense, men whose professional standing and authority within the regiment far exceeded their formal classification. The American guidance couldn't fix that structural incompatibility, but it could instruct American soldiers to treat the gap with appropriate respect when they encountered Commonwealth warrant officers in the field. Additional incidents continued to occur after the revised guidance was issued. The guidance had been written. American soldiers still had not been systematically trained on what a crown on an Australian sleeve meant, what a warrant officer, Class II appointment of company sergeant major implied in terms of accumulated service and professional standing, or why addressing such a man by his surname without his rank in a public street was not a minor procedural variation but a serious breach of military courtesy with measurable diplomatic consequences. The guidance helped. It did not solve the underlying problem because the underlying problem was not a guidance problem. It was a training and cultural literacy problem that ran deep through the structure of how American forces were prepared for alliance operations. The Australian military police, meanwhile, drew their own conclusions and adjusted their practice accordingly. After the Vung Tau incident, Australian MP training for Vietnam service began to include increasingly detailed briefings on American rank structures, American legal authorities in country, and the specific tendency of American forces to misread Commonwealth insignia. Australian corporals deployed to Vung Tau were instructed quietly and firmly that part of their job was to protect Australian personnel from the well-meaning but poorly informed actions of their American counterparts. They were told to watch American military police carefully when Australian soldiers were involved in any incident, to intervene early, to use the radio aggressively, to get Australian officers or senior NCOs on scene before situations could escalate past the point of easy resolution. It was a kind of constant, exhausting translation. Two professional armies working alongside each other, sharing streets and patrols and logistics operations and rest centers, each operating on a different set of institutional assumptions that they had each arrived in Vietnam with, and that Vietnam itself had done little to reconcile. The Australians had learned to be translators in their own defense because no one else was going to do it for them. There is a larger story inside the smaller one. The incident on those Vung Tau streets in the summer of 1968 was, at one level, a simple case of a young soldier making an error because his training had left a gap. At another level, it was a compressed expression of something much larger and more complicated about what it meant to be a small professional army fighting alongside a massive one. ATTV members were specially selected with up to two-thirds of personnel in early rotations possessing Malayan experience. These were not men who had arrived in Asia without context. They had come through the Malayan emergency, through Borneo, through years of jungle operations that had refined their professional judgment in the specific environment where they were now advising. Rank selection for the AATTV was unique in the history of Australian Army training teams, with most members being either officers or warrant officers. The Australian Army had made a deliberate institutional choice to send its most experienced, non-commissioned professionals, not just its commissioned officers, to do the most demanding advisory work in the most isolated conditions. That choice reflected a cultural belief in the professional authority and competence of the warrant officer that had no precise American equivalent. When an American military policeman put handcuffs on an Australian warrant officer Class II, he was not just misreading an insignia. He was, without knowing it, reaching into the deepest institutional conviction of the Australian Army and misclassifying it as something lesser than it was. The Australian warrant officer did not raise his voice. He did not resist. He stated, calmly and precisely, that the rank being applied to him did not exist in the Australian understanding of what he was, and in that moment, on a humid street with handcuffs on his wrists and a group of stunned Australian infantry watching from the footpath, the entire cultural weight of what an Australian warrant officer meant came down to 8 words. This rank does not exist in our army. He was right. The American warrant officer, the sergeant, was mentally treating him as young, technical, barely out of training, at the beginning of a career, did not exist in the Australian Army's rank structure. What existed in the Australian Army was something the American system had no direct category for. A man who had spent his entire professional life becoming the finest soldier his army knew how to produce below the commissioned rank, who had been tested in multiple conflicts across multiple countries, who had been trusted with the lives of Vietnamese soldiers in the Central Highlands without a commissioned officer anywhere nearby, and who wore a crown on his sleeve as the record of everything those years had made him. The AATTV was Australia's most decorated unit of the war, including all 4 Victoria Crosses awarded during the conflict. It is believed to be the most decorated Australian unit to serve in Vietnam. Its members received over 100 decorations during its existence. The unit that produced those Victoria Crosses, those Distinguished Conduct Medals, those military medals, was built on the professional capability of its warrant officers. 3 of the 4 Victoria Crosses went to men wearing crowns on their sleeves. The 4th went to Major Peter Badco, who had himself served alongside warrant officers for years, and who understood, as all officers who served with the AATTV understood, that the warrant officers were the operational backbone of everything the unit achieved. The arresting sergeant received his remedial training. He completed his tour. He went home. The warrant officer returned to his company in the Central Highlands and to the grinding, patient work of the advisor's life. The 2 majors went back to their respective headquarters and their respective paperwork. The revised guidance went out through American channels. The joint patrols continued. The photograph was taken in December 1969, showing the Australian, the American, and the Vietnamese military policemen standing together before a morning patrol at the Vung Tau Marshal's office. The combination of an Australian, American, and a Vietnamese can handle almost any situation that may occur in Vung Tau, which is a leave and rest center for most of the Allied nations involved in the war. But the photograph does not tell you about the year before. It does not tell you about the 40 minutes 2 majors spent in a corner of a cinder-block building, working out how to prevent a handcuff incident from becoming a diplomatic crisis. It does not tell you about the warrant officer on the wooden bench, writing his notes with the borrowed pen, methodically recording every detail of a failure that should never have happened, and that his training and his army's traditions had equipped him to respond to with complete professional composure. The story of what happened in Vung Tau in 1968 is not really a story about one incident. It is a story about what happens when 2 Allied armies, fighting the same war on the same streets, never fully explained themselves to each other. The Americans arrived in Vietnam with a rank system shaped by their own history, their own wars, their own institutional evolution. The Australians arrived with a system shaped by British tradition, the Malayan emergency, Borneo, Korea, and decades of professional development that had produced a warrant officer culture with no American equivalent. Both systems worked inside their own armies. Neither had been adequately explained to the other. In the gap between those two explanations, a professional soldier sat on a wooden bench in Vung Tau and wrote his report. He had been put in handcuffs. He had been addressed incorrectly. He had been treated as something he was not. And he had responded with 8 words that were, in their quiet precision, more professionally devastating than any amount of protest or resistance could ever have been. This rank does not exist in our army. The handcuffs came off. The system corrected itself, as institutional systems eventually do when forced to. The guidance was issued. The training was updated. The joint patrols continued, and the alliance endured, as it always does, imperfectly, through friction, through the kind of institutional learning that only happens when something goes wrong, and someone, somewhere, has the professional dignity to say so with complete calm. The warrant officer's name does not appear in the documents that are publicly available. But the 8 words exist. The photograph exists. The guidance exists. The story exists. And the story belongs quietly and completely to a man who understood that a rank is not just an insignia. It is the record of everything a professional soldier has become. It cannot be misread by someone who has never been trained to read it. And when it is misread, when the crown is confused for something lesser, when decades of professional service are collapsed into a wrong category by someone who doesn't know better, the correct response is not anger. The correct response is to say, clearly and without heat, what is actually true. This rank does not exist in our army. The rank you think you see. The junior specialist. The young man with the bar. That one does not exist here. What exists here is something else entirely. Something with a name that looks familiar but means something your training never prepared you for. And then you sit down on the wooden bench and you start writing your report, because the system is going to need a paper trail to learn from this, and you are the most qualified person in the room to provide one.